7th-generation resident of Suwannee County. Pretty amazing. He grew up on the family's country homestead. He developed a love of history, and it's remained strong throughout his life, as you'll hear in just a little bit. He graduated from Suwannee High School, Montgomery, Alabama's Faulkner University, where he got a Bachelor of Science degree in history at the age of 19, with a perfect grade point average of 4.0. He returned home to Suwannee County in 1998, began working for the Suwannee County Clerk of Court. He remains there today as the county historian, the records manager, the clerk to the board, among other duties as assigned. Eric has been the youngest member of the Suwannee County Historical Commission since he was appointed in 2003, which doesn't seem like a long time ago, but you say, wait a minute, that's 21 years. Eric is a frequent presenter of local histories that are mentioned in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune, among hundreds of other prominent national and international newspapers. I don't know how many people like that. He was awarded the 2011 Trailblazer Award by Suwannee County Chamber of Commerce for his work in preserving and presenting local history. He's also published a weekly historical column for the then local newspaper, the Suwannee Democrat, from 2013 until the paper ceased publication in mid-2020. I'll get this down. He married his college sweetheart, Sarah. They live in Live Oak with their 2 kids, Alex and Abby. He's the author of 5 published books about Suwannee County. Reflections of Suwannee County, Suwannee Memories, There Let Me Live and Die, Images of America, Suwannee County, and Lost Suwannee County. So, with no further ado, here is the great author and historian.
Said you get me. Yeah, There Let Me Live and Die is one of the phrases from Way Down Upon the Suwannee River. That's where that phrase comes from. I know it's kind of weird, but
It's a tongue twister.
It is a tongue twister, yeah. It's from Stephen Foster's song, so that's where they came from. And that was from last year. I didn't realize I needed a biography until this morning. I printed it real quick. But I have since started in the local newspaper, the new one that had popped up, Riverbend News. So I started a couple weeks ago, weekly articles again. So you can see some old ones and some new ones if you're interested. But this afternoon, we are here for transportation in Suwannee County. A couple hours ago, I did a presentation on railroads, which I've done before in part of my ongoing series that I do locally for Suwannee County history. I've got 36, 38, 39 presentations, different presentations that I go through to talk about our history. Well, I did one on railroads, and then when this came up with this festival, I realized I haven't done one on other kinds of transportation. They're kind of interspersed in the histories, but not just one on transportation in Suwannee County other than railroads. So you have it today, kind of a new presentation, I guess, that incorporates parts of other presentations. So we're going to talk about a few major aspects of transportation, mainly ferries. We're going to talk about steamboats, and then we're going to talk a little bit about aircraft, airports, and whatnot. So ferries have been, up until the last 100 years, have been the predominant way of transportation across the Suwannee River. The Suwannee County is surrounded on 3 sides by the river, so if you want to get, say, Madison, Hamilton, or any other counties other than Columbia, you're going to have to go by ferry if you live here 200 years ago, 150 years ago. And so ferries became very important, not just over the Suwannee River, but also the Santa Fe River, the Itchtucknee River, even places that really no longer exist like Little River, Rocky Creek, all kinds of different places. And they were around until first railroads, and then later on automobiles became affordable, and they needed more automobile bridges. So we used ferries up until the early 1900s here in Suwannee County. Some places, actually, along the Suwannee River further down, used them up to the 1940s and 50s. So it's kind of weird to see this at the time, a modern car in the 1940, like 48 or so, being taken across the Suwannee River. This was at, let's see which place it is. I wrote it down, I thought. Oh, I didn't put it down. But Fowler's Bluff or somewhere down there, further on the Suwannee River. But it's weird to see this old wooden ferry carrying a modern, at the time, automobile. So that's kind of funny. Now, as we go through here, I'm going to talk about ferries, but you have to realize that these ferries change names a lot. When I talk about railroads, they change names a lot. Ferries changed even more often because it would be named after usually the owner. So the way the state normally did it was you had a 10-year charter on a ferry crossing. This was yours to develop, and nobody could build any ferry from 5 miles either way of the river. So they were interspersed where you could get to where you needed to go, but not they were next door to each other. So there was competition, but not next door to you, literally. And so these ferry crossings had to be maintained for 10 years. And if you didn't maintain it, the state would give the ferry to another person who would then call it by their name. So, for instance, the one that's down at Suwannee River State Park, it started off as McCormick's Ferry in the early 1830s, and then by the late 1830s, 1840s, it was Platt's Ferry, and then by the 1870s and 80s, it was Dean's Ferry, and so on and so forth before it was replaced by a vehicle bridge. So as we go through these, I'm not necessarily going to get into every single one of those ferries because there's lots of them with lots of different names. So that is a map of the ferries I know of, excuse me, that were in Suwannee County. You'll see, of course, most of them are along the Suwannee River. You've got a couple down at the bottom right that are on the Santa Fe River. You've got one towards the middle of the county, which is over what used to be Little River, which is not as much of today, but it used to be a small, I guess, a creek of sorts that you needed a ferry to cross over. And then up here, Rocky Creek. So you've got several throughout the county, but mainly focused on the Suwannee River. And again, these were called various names, but eventually the county would start naming roads once vehicles were built, or even trails before vehicles came around. They would name it the road to so-and-so's ferry, and then it just came to be called so-and-so ferry's road. So for instance, this road up here that still exists, there is a county road name, and I forget what the number is, but it's Noble's Ferry, because Noble's Ferry was up there at the top. So you'll see that in some of the roads. It's CR 249. I had to write it down. County Road 249, aka, for those who've been around, before the 911 addressing system, Noble's Ferry, because that was the ferry that it went to. So we've got lots of those. Now, ferries have been around since way before the United States even existed. The Spanish put in the first known ferries back in the 1600s once they started establishing communities in what's now Suwannee County, mission sites and such. And so they established them in several locations, but one in particular crossed the Suwannee River as part of what was called the Spanish Royal Road, or the Camino Real. And that went from what's St. Augustine over to Pensacola, which were the two capitals, if you will, way back when. And so that crossed at what is now called Charles Springs. And so that was part of the original Camino Real. And so there was a ferry there, along with some of the other places too, down around the Santa Fe and such. They would sometimes use the natural bridge where the Santa Fe goes underground for a couple of miles, but they would also use ferries from time to time. But the majority of the main ferries that we know of during the Spanish era was there at what's now Charles Springs. The Native Americans were used as labor on that, and there are the records, existing records from the Spanish, that showed the Indians didn't like to do that. It was a lot of hard work. And so you read about a lot of them fleeing, running away, especially I guess they didn't like the ferry crossing because they had to be at the beck and call of whoever was coming across from the other side. They wanted to come over at 2 a.m., you got to get the folks up to move the ferry. So Indians do not like that, lots of manual labor. This is an unknown ferry, but it is along the Suwannee River, and this drawing, if you will, is from a postcard from the early 1900s. So when the United States was established in 1776, got its independence in 1783, this was Spanish territory, who continued to use that Camino Real. But by the 1820s, we have our first American settlers moving into Suwannee County. First ones being Reuben and Rebecca Charles. And they moved here by 1824. And we know that for a couple reasons. The main reason being they chartered a ferry. Reuben Charles chartered a ferry at Charles Springs, which was the old Spanish Royal Road, but it was also the road that was going between St. Augustine and Pensacola, which were now the capitals of East and West Florida at the time, before they decided on Tallahassee as the central location for the state capital. And so he knew where that location was, so he bought up and made a ferry crossing, plus an inn, plus a trading post. So he basically had a whole turnkey operation there at that ferry. And he opened it up, and that's why it's called Charles Springs, because of the Charles family. So for the next 20 years, you've got lots of ferries. A lot of those spots that I showed you a couple minutes ago are popping up. Ferries are being used there. But again, generally 10 years. But not everybody made it 10 years. People either died, they went broke, they decided, I want to move. We had the Seminole War. Second Seminole War was fought, part of it around here, and so a lot of the ferry owners decided, you know what, it's not worth my life to live here. I'm going to go back to civilization. And so you see lots of turnover. Now, the ferries originally, while Florida was still a territory, and even the early part of statehood, they had to petition the state or the territory of Florida to charter that. And so the state has a lot of records of that. Later on, it was the counties that were responsible for it. And so we've got in the clerk's office where I work, we have old ferry records, lots of things. It shows several things like they show the name of the people, first and last, sometimes middle names of the ferry owners over the years. And again, some of them had 10 different names over the years. So it shows that. It also, not always, but sometimes gives the exact location, like township range and section and everything. Sometimes they use antique terms like where so-and-so's farm was. That's not very helpful. Not very helpful. But sometimes it shows you exactly where modern township range and sections we still use. They also show, based on the listings, shows you what kind of things cross the river. You've got people walking. You've got horse and carriages. You've got 8-horse, 6-horse, 4-horse, 2-horse. You've got 1-horse shows. You've got pigs, cows, those kinds of things. They have charges for all these different items. So that tells me that those things were a regular occurrence. And so they could charge to cross the river. And then, of course, it shows how much they would charge. So here's one. There's Reuben Becker Charles. I must have flipped. I didn't flip. That's the Charles Ferry. And this is the transcript in the state archives of that original charter for his ferry in 1824. Again, this was when it was a territory. And those are two modern day pictures of the Charles Springs boat landing, which was where the ferry was. And over on the top right is Charles Springs itself. This is from the 1870s, or 1880s, excuse me, the end of the 1870s. It shows the Ivy Ferry. It's J.A. Ivy and Brothers. His brother, the more well-known brother in Suwannee County history, is Robert Ivy. Robert Ivy, we'll talk about in a little bit, was a big steamboat builder, among other things in Suwannee County. But they purchased this ferry, and they were chartered to be able to use it. Come on in, have a seat. Glad to have y'all. And so this is a portion that we have at the clerk's office, showing how much things cost. So if you wanted to transport a 6-horse wagon, it would cost you $1 in 1880 fees. Now inflation's about 30 times, so it would cost you $30 to cross the river. That's one way. You'd have to come back. So it gets expensive to cross. And that is part of the reason a lot of folks never left their home county, especially if they were around rivers. I couldn't pay $60 a day just to travel back and forth. A lot of other people couldn't. So $30 for that. Even going down to a man and a horse was 10 cents. A sheep, goats, and hogs, a penny each. And you're not just moving over one or two, you're moving over flocks. And so it could add up very quickly. So even a sheep, goat, or hog, that's 30 cents per head. So that does add up. But these ferries became very prominent in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s as Suwannee County not only been established, but it was growing. For instance, let's see. Woods Ferry, run by Allen Woods. That's on the Woods Ferry tract that's now owned by the Suwannee River Water Management. It's up on the north end of the county. You've got Nobles Ferry, I've already mentioned, that goes to the northwest, going into Hamilton County. Nobles Ferry for many years. You've got a ferry at Columbus, which became Ellaville, which became the Suwannee River State Park. And I've already told you some of the folks listed in that, 8 or 10 different ones we know of, that ran that ferry. Horton's Ferry, run by John J. Horton at what's now Dowling Park. They've got the ferry landing actually there. And as you go through, you will see that most of these ferries, even though the ferry itself doesn't exist, it's usually a boat ramp. So a lot of our boat ramps were old ferry crossings. It just made it simple. It's already dug down, already ramped down. Why reinvent the wheel when we just reuse this old ferry crossing? Same thing with some of our roads. Irvin's Ferry, this picture here, Irvin's Ferry, run by Washington Lafayette Irvin, who established Louisville. Louisville is named after his daughter, Laura. He ran it for many years before he passed on. That apparently is a picture of him holding the post there on the right-hand front side of that ferry. So that was running in the 1870s. In the 1880s, you've got places like Grant's Ferry, run by William Grant and some others. And that was at Convict Springs down at the south end of the county. Not too far away, I guess within more than 5 miles from him. You've got Roland's Bluff Ferry. That was run by the Ivies in a place that's now called Branford. So you've got lots of these ferries running. Here is a petition we have at the clerk's office of Grant's Ferry from 1873. So again, they're petitioning the county commissioners, hey, can I establish a ferry at this certain location? They had to put up a bond. They had to try to prove where they were worthy of doing it. So that's just one of several we've got at the courthouse, clerk's office. This is the Dowling Park Ferry, which would have been Horton's Ferry. Another postcard, and somebody's written on it over here. Hey, how about that? But they would use them as postcards a lot of times. And this one is the one at Dowling Park. So that would have been Horton's Ferry at one point anyway, called Horton's Ferry. Well, gradually as and this is 1906, as the early 1900s rolled through, we've got automobiles being mass produced. We've got lots more people being able to buy them. And so these ferries are not being used as much. And so one by one, these ferries shut down. They would stop being used. But again, you can still go to a lot of the county boat ramps, and there's a good chance that was a ferry crossing at one point. They'd also sometimes put roads over them. Interstate 75 is over the old Indian ferry crossing, I think is what it was called. So these major roads we've got.
How are they powered?
Ferry by the water. You just basically tied a cable, originally rode within metal cables, and you would just guide it based on the river's current. It's like at a slight angle and back and forth. And pretty much the owners would live right next door on the bluff so they could hear people. And a lot of times you will read about on the other side of where their house was, they'd have something like a bell or something loud banging on a big metal pipe. And that would wake them up at whatever time and say, oh, there's somebody else across the ferry. So it was not something you could just put in operation and then walk off. You had to you or somebody else had to physically be there to handle. This was not a cross at your own risk kind of thing. This was the ferry owners doing it for you. So one by one, they went away. Again, there were still some on the Suwannee River in the 1940s with that car I showed you earlier. So that kind of ended ferries at the time. We've also got, as part of transportation in Suwannee County, and a good part of it anyway, steamboats. Steamboats, obviously not as old as ferry crossings. The first steamboats were built in the early 1800s, and by the 1830s, we have the first known steamboats going up and down the Suwannee River. 1836 is the first known one that I found anyway. And that's at the beginning of the Second Seminole War, which was fought between 1835 and 1836 and ended in 1842. It was our longest war until Vietnam. Most people don't know that. But we had several forts that had been established along the Suwannee River and elsewhere. That's why we have a place in Columbia County called Fort White. It was a fort. Now, not a huge fort like in St. Augustine that you see today. Not that big. Usually these forts were nothing more than a house or a trading post, and they may have some timber stuck out that's been sharpened, and they may have a contingent of soldiers there to help protect. But a lot of places in Suwannee County, that's all the fort was, nothing more. And so these steamboats were used to provide transportation services for the soldiers, for bringing supplies in, especially with the Indian attacks going on even in Suwannee County throughout the Second Seminole War. And so we see those coming through. The first known steamboat was one called the Minerva, and I don't have any pictures or drawings of some of these early steamboats. We don't know. They probably would have been a stern wheeler. Not even sure about that for some of them. Not huge boats, maybe 100 feet long, 120 feet long tops, for those early ones anyway. There is a report, and it's never been confirmed, but I have read it for years, that some of these steamboats were used to deliver goods to Suwannee Springs. There was a fort at Suwannee Springs at that time, and the river had flooded. Number one, it had flooded. Normally you couldn't go up that far upriver on a steamboat, but because it had flooded, they could go all the way up there. And they were kind of cut off from the surroundings because of the river and also the Indian attacks, and so they brought supplies. That's the story. Never seen any independent confirmation of that, but I've read that throughout other history, so I'm passing it on to y'all. But we do know that in 1839, there was a proposal by the territorial, at that time, legislature to clear obstructions from the mouth and the lower reaches of the Suwannee River. So we know steamboats were coming up by that point because they wanted to clear them out to make some channels that were at least 9 foot deep. These steamboats, by and large, that were on the Suwannee River had a draft of about 4 or 5 feet. So if you cleared a 9 foot channel, that gives you a few feet of difference so you don't run aground. So they proposed it, and either it was completed or they did something differently, because by 1845, we've got our first steamboat with regular runs on the Suwannee River, regular service, called the Orpheus. And in October, she began making weekly mail runs from Cedar Key up into Suwannee County, what's now Suwannee County, all the way up to Columbus, which is the Suwannee River State Park today. That, at the time, was our largest community. So they were coming all the way upriver to the Suwannee River State Park. Kind of hard to believe. And then somehow they'd be able to turn around and go back downriver. So this was probably not the largest steamboat ever, but it was good enough to be able to come upriver. And so that was being used for a couple of years. Unfortunately, the Orpheus sank on the Suwannee River in 1847 because there's reports from the state of auctioning her remains. So she probably ran aground, got out of the channel or something, and ran aground, was sunk, and her remains were sold. Columbus, this is a picture of part of the area of Columbus. It was still important enough in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, to have this railroad bridge, which we talked about in the previous presentation, to have that. And that was one of the main focuses of the Union Army when the Battle of Lusty happened. That was the main place they were going, was to destroy this railroad bridge. This picture was taken in the 1870s or 1880s. During the heyday of sawmill operations there, you can see in the Suwannee River all that timber that they were floating downriver to the sawmill just on the other side and to the right of that bridge. You can see some of the smoke looks like. Could just be the photograph, but there was a sawmill just past it to the right. Pre-Civil War. Before we get to the Civil War, we've got Captain James Tucker. He is living in Madison County, but he is operating a regular steamboat service on the Suwannee River. So he builds a steamboat apparently up in New Albany, Indiana, either in 1854 or 1855. He names the steamboat Madison after where he was living. And the steamboat, we know a little bit about it. She was 120 feet long, 22 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and displaced 99 tons. So 4 feet depth under the water, 120 feet long. So we know steamboats that big at least could go up the Suwannee River. And what he would do basically is use this as a floating country general store. So it's kind of like Cracker Barrel, but in the front part of Cracker Barrel on the river. But he would bring all kinds of stuff that we couldn't build here, we couldn't make here. We didn't have ironworks, we didn't have factories in the Suwannee County. And so he would bring things from, say, New Orleans or Key West, even simple things like pots and pans. We couldn't make them here. And so he would ship that stuff in, bring the mail, bring whatever else that he had, that fine linens and such, and would sell them at steamboat landings or ferry crossings. He would stop, he would blow his whistle, and according to the records, you could hear it 10 miles away. So that gave you time to get your stuff gathered and go to the ferry landing or to the steamboat landing, bring your stuff. We didn't have banks here. The nearest bank, I believe, was in Savannah at the time. So it's not like you were paying in cash. You would barter. You would bring your deer skins. You would bring your cotton. You would bring whatever it is you had as a trade. And so he would do that for a while and then go to the next landing. And then he'd go back downriver, sell that stuff, and bring more goods in. So just back and forth, back and forth. He was also bringing in the mail service, which helped him also with that contract. So for many years, the state, territory and then state, said that the Suwannee River could not be navigated past the town of Columbus, which is, again, it's Suwannee River State Park. He thought otherwise. So he made it his mission to go upriver as far as he could. So he did that to prove them wrong. He was helped by the fact that there was a lot of rain, it was flooding. So the river is a little bit higher than it normally would have been. And so he went all the way up to White Springs. So that's a good run on a 120-foot long steamboat. I can't imagine today having a steamboat that big coming in. Come on in. We're having a presentation. Come on in.
Yeah, there's a presentation going on.
Yeah, come on in. We're talking about transportation.
There's a presentation going on.
So he steams up to White Springs. Now, even with the river rising, he's got some issues because now he's running into trees that have been overhanging. And so by the time he gets to White Springs, he's lost his smokestacks, his funnels, and his pilot house on the top of the ship. They're gone. The trees have knocked him off. But he made it. Most of the boat, anyway, made it to White Springs. And so by the time he gets his boat repaired, the state says, all right, y'all can travel up to White Springs. Now, how often that actually happened, we don't know. Again, that was when the river was high. But maybe some smaller boats. Now, the saga of the steamboat Madison doesn't end there. Excuse me. Because when the Civil War begins, 1861, he is an officer with the Confederates, and he uses that steamboat basically as a makeshift gunboat. He has some soldiers thrown on there, maybe a gun thrown on the front of the boat, and they basically steam up and down the river to protect it from Union attacks. And on July 4th, 1861, the war is only a couple months old at this point, and July 4th, that's an American holiday, the Madison steams out to the mouth of the Suwannee and captures a few ships, a few small schooners and stuff that had been captured by the Union. So he recaptures them and brings them back, all the goods and stuff they had on board, and so brings them back into Confederate use. Well, as 1863 comes and goes, Civil War's not looking so good. We've lost Vicksburg, Gettysburg has been lost, and so the Confederacy is needing more and more men. They're needing more and more materials, and so Captain Tucker and his men are ordered northward to join the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee. And so he leaves the steamboat Madison, who's still been patrolling the Suwannee River. He leaves that with a group of locals, and he basically tells them, hey, y'all sink my steamboat in Troy Springs, because when the war ends, the thought is he's probably going to come back and raise it and put it back into service. Well, so these three guys do that. They steam to Troy Springs, but in the meantime, there's a lot of folks around the river that are starving. The Union blockade has cut off a lot of supplies, and so they bring one last load of corn and stuff up river, and then they steam to Troy Springs, scuttle the steamboat Madison. Well, the war ends in 1865. Captain Tucker doesn't come back to retrieve the boat because you've still got 2 years left between 1863 and 1865, and salt is something that's needed to preserve. You don't have refrigerators, you don't have stores to go to. You have to preserve, especially the meats that you get. And what's the easiest way to do that when you're living close to the coast? Is to go to the Gulf and to boil water and then get the salt out of it. Well, for that you need metal troughs, metal something to put the water in to boil out. And so what some settlers figure out is, why should I go buy me maybe some metal when there's a good steamboat right there with lots of metal I can get? How about the funnels, the smokestacks? They're already curved and metal, just cut them in half. How about the boilers? Same thing. Round, cut them in half. I can use those to boil lots of water. And so part of the steamboat is scavenged for the next 2 years. Plus, why should I go cut down trees to build me a house when there's a steamboat sitting there with all pre-cut timber? So by the end of the war, basically, there's nothing left above the water of the steamboat Madison. And so she stayed in the river. This is a picture from the early 1900s showing the hull, part of the hull of the steamboat Madison. Let's see if I got another. Yeah, I got another one. A couple more. So Troy Springs has the remains of the steamboat Madison. This is another picture, I think. There we go. From a different angle showing the bottom of the hull of the steamboat. There's some discussion by historians as to whether this is the same steamboat because the length is shorter. Well, the length is shorter, I would suggest, because the stern wheel's gone. That whole aft portion is gone. So it's not a complete ship. But the back part's washed off in the river after all the years. But everything else seems to point to it being Steamboat Madison, so that's what I'm going to say. This is a picture I took in, let's see what year, 2007, I think? Yeah. I was visiting Troy Springs. There was 1 foot of water over the hull. So I was with a snorkel just pulling along, swimming along the timbers. So if you go to Troy Springs when it's low water, not now, but when it's low water, you can go there. State Park, you can go in there and see the steamboat. The spring head itself is off to the left out of the view of the picture. So Steamboat Madison, what's left of it is still there today. One of 3 or 4 known steamboats that are along the Suwannee River even still today. Well, Civil War kind of ends the steamboating for a while. Madison is the last one we know of in 1863. So after the war, it takes a couple years to pick back up, but eventually it does. And so by 1872, we've got the steamboat Wawanock, who was originally built up north and served in the Union Army or the Union military, was transferred down to the Suwannee River, and she steamed up and down river for a few years, and then she was transferred over in 1874 to New Orleans, Pensacola, that area, and kept working over there for a few more years. She was replaced by the steamboat David L. Yulee, which was named after a pre-war senator, the same guy that Yulee's named after in Levy County, David Levy Yulee. Anyway, he was a big wig in Florida, early Florida. And so this steamboat, which was 89 tons, only 82 feet long, and she spent most, if not all of her time along the Suwannee River. But eventually she was condemned and abandoned in 1885, and her hull was left to sink close to the mouth of the Suwannee River. That's a picture of it in the 1958, with trees growing out of the middle. So she'd been there for a long time. And I think part of her is still there, probably underwater now. But that's one of the steamboats. Another steamboat was the steamboat Erie, built in Jacksonville, 1876. She was just 34 tons. She was pretty short, 70 feet long, 21 feet wide. 2 decks. She had 3 officers and 12 men. And she sometimes carried passengers, but normally she was used to carry goods. And this is a good picture. It shows a standard steamboat that steamed along the Suwannee River, and pretty much most of that first deck is open. That's where they would stuff the timber. They were not coal-fired. They were not oil-fired. They were fired by all the timber, wood-fired. So you put your timber on the first deck and some of your cargo, and then you've got staterooms on top for the crew and also for passengers. And so she steamed aboard on the Suwannee River for a few years, but then in 1884 was transferred down to Manatee County. This is one like her. So this is kind of, again, the standard look of a lot of the steamboats. Henry Plant, I talked about in the railroads presentation a couple hours ago. Henry Plant was one of the 2 big Henrys in Florida's transportation history. Henry Flagler and Henry Plant. They both built railroads throughout the state of Florida. Millionaires, multimillionaires. Henry Plant did more than just railroads. He also built steamboats. This was one of his, called the Caddo Bell, that began operations in 1883. 125 feet long. She was a stern-wheeled 2-decker. And again, she could haul freight on that first deck and then passengers on the top. This is she's a bigger one than the one I just showed you. Not so good to begin with. She was eventually abandoned on the Apalachicola River. And a lot of what happened was a lot of them started out on the Suwannee River, or one time on the Suwannee River, but then as more railroads came through, they transferred to, say, Apalachicola, which had a bigger river and less railroad transportation. And so this was one of them, the Caddo Bell. And that's what happened. Also, we have the Bertha Lee, 130 feet long. She was on for a few years and then transferred down to Fort Myers. And her trip down there was kind of interesting in 1883 because they wanted to steam her up the Kissimmee River so she could go in that area around Kissimmee, Fort Myers, those kind of things, and maybe get all the way to Lake Okeechobee. And so there is a story, not a story, it's true, but the records show that the captain and the crew went down there, and it was tough because they couldn't really get to the boat, was too big. So what they had to do, it normally took 3 to 5 days, but because she was so big, it took 53 days to get basically from the Gulf of Mexico up to through the Kissimmee River and whatnot. And at times, because the boat was so big, the crew had to get out and dig their own channel to get through to a deeper area. And sometimes they would have to turn the steamboat around and use the stern wheel to move the dirt. So I mean, it was a very laborious thing they did. But eventually, after 53 days, they got there. They actually ran low on food and water and wood for the ship, so they had to barter with the Seminole Indians that lived down there. So it's an interesting story to read. But they quickly realized, okay, maybe she's a little too big for the river. So they pushed her out of the Kissimmee River. So she went to the St. John's, which was much bigger. So all that work for nothing, pretty much. And let's see, a couple places. She eventually went over to the Apalachicola River, Chattahoochee River, and she burned and wrecked, and the captain lost all of his savings. He then worked at a hotel for years, rebuilt it, rebuilt his money, and then bought some other ones. So that's the Bertha Lee picture. There at Columbus, Georgia, just before she transferred to the Suwannee River. Benjamin Hall, that was the captain. So he owned her, then lost a fortune on her, and then rebuilt it. He was Irish descent. He was a Quaker, lived around Massachusetts, then Pittsburgh, and then West Virginia, started his work up there, and then moved down to Florida, New Orleans, Pensacola, and then Florida. Captain Ivy, Robert Absalom Ivy, who I mentioned earlier with the ferry crossings. Sorry. Got to turn my phone off. And he operated ferries. He actually served in the Civil War as a 14-year-old before they realized how young he was and said, "You're out of here." But his dad was a minister. They lived down in what's now the Branford area, Louisville, Branford area. He and his brothers bought up lots of property, started ferries, but he also realized, you know what, steamboats might be the way to go. And so he started building steamboats in a place called Rollins Bluff, which is now Branford. Captain Ivy is the one that named Branford. And he named Branford, if you were in the railroad presentation, because Branford, Connecticut was the home of his good friend Henry Plant, one of the two Henrys of Florida, railroad history. So his good friend was Henry Plant, so he named this Rollins Bluff community, renamed it New Branford, and then they dropped the new and became Branford. Well, that's where he lived for most of his life. He built steamboats, he built a hotel, those kinds of things. His most famous steamboat, not the first, but his most famous was named the Belle of the Suwannee. Some others we don't have time necessarily to look at, but the C.D. Owens, he named several steamboats Suwannee. He liked the name Suwannee, so he named those. Let's see if we got a picture. This is some of the steamboats here. He became mayor of Branford in the late 1800s also. So Branford is what it is because of this guy. But this is the same steamboat, two pictures basically about 80, 90 years apart. Sorry. So this was one of the Suwannees that he built, and this one moved down to Lake Okeechobee. A guy you might have heard of by the name of Henry Ford and Thomas Edison, especially Thomas Edison, liked to use this boat to travel on. And so eventually the steamboat was wrecked, but it was rebuilt, put up by Henry Ford up into his museum and stuff up north was it Deerfield? Dearborn, thank you. Greenfield Village and such. And it operated until the early 2000s, and they decided finally to scrap her in 2011. So unfortunate. So it's the same boat, lots of repairs and renovations between the two. Belle of Suwannee was his most famous steamboat, built in 1889, served until 1900, there we go. That was famous for its catfish dinners and its honeymoon cruise. A lot of honeymooners would get on the boat and go up and down the river. So built in Brantford by Captain Ivy and some others. And a lot of the photos we have are of the Belle of Suwannee, just because we do. Very famous. She was named after Captain Ivy's daughter, Bertha, who was the belle of his eyes, his daughter. And so named Belle of Suwannee. She later became, her husband was a doctor that became mayor of Brantford also, F.H. George. So let's see. As she steamed around for several years, there was a big hurricane in 1896, and that kind of wiped out a lot of the timber in the area, and it stopped a lot of steamboats from steaming on the river. It damaged some of them, but it just wasn't as profitable after 1896 to steam along the river. And so a lot of the steamboats were sold, or they were repurposed. Instead of using passengers, they were more of just cargo, general cargo and stuff. And that was one of them. So she sank in 1900 off the mouth of the Suwannee River as she was transporting goods to one of the pencil factories in Cedar Key. Dan McQueen was probably her most famous pilot. He was a mulatto, so he was part African American, part white, and he was said to know every nook and cranny in the Suwannee River. He could navigate in complete darkness. That was how good he was. So he served starting as like a dishwasher, moved all the way up to basically captain or pilot, in charge of steaming the steamboats around. He also taught down in Old Town, so he did lots of different things. Helped build the Belle of Suwannee. One of the other steamboats on the river, beginning in 1893, was the Sam Powell's. She had been on Lake Panasoffkee. Nephew over there was living there until recently. She was on Lake Panasoffkee, but then they moved her to the Suwannee River. She was one of those that was owned by Henry Plant in one of his subsidiary companies. And she was only 31 tons, so she was pretty small, 76 feet long. That's a pretty small boat. But she operated on the Suwannee River. She was badly damaged in that hurricane of 1896. But she was repaired and then eventually laid up on the Suwannee River. Louisa, another one. And this was built by Captain E.L. Magruder, who was a competitor of Captain Ivy. And she came in 1894. She was big, 200 tons, big steamboat, and operated here for a little while. And then she moved over to Apalachicola River, and then she finally sank in 1904 on the Santee River. Let's see. Picture of a community called Peak, which was close to Louisville, but at the river. But if you look closely between the freight depot and the steamboat, there is what probably was a ferry crossing at one point, but the railroad backs all the way up to the river. So you could unload and load onto the steamboats very easily. And I've got the next picture is going to show that same location, same place. That was the C.D. Owens, and that was Captain Ivy's biggest boat, 231 tons, 135 feet long. And she operated for a few years. The hurricane of 1896 hit. It wasn't profitable, so he sold her. Eventually, she sank over in Columbus, Georgia in 1899. She burned and sank, took a couple of steamboats with her. 1896 hurricane, that's Cedar Key, devastated. They actually, the island that we know of is in location we know of Cedar Key today is not the same Cedar Key that it was prior to 1896. Basically, this hurricane wiped out all the buildings, and the few that survived, they moved to a different island, which used to be called Depot Key, I believe. The original one was at Sina Oe Key, but they moved the entire town, what was left of it, to a new island. And it continued to be called Cedar Key. So when you go to Cedar Key today, you'll go to the town of Cedar Key, but there's another island a little bit offshore, that's got the remains of the original Cedar Key. There's some graves and such that are left. But it was a bad storm. So after 1896, you've got a lot of steamboats being sold, again, including the Belle of Suwannee, which is sold into general transportation for goods. But some other people try to get involved after 1896. You've got the CU Shepherd coming in, and the Thetis, several other smaller steamboats. It's not as profitable to have the big ones, so they bring smaller ones in, but pretty much most of these are gone by the early 1900s. The Thetis, which is brought in by Captain Magruder, she sailed on the Suwannee River to about 1913. So we've got automobiles coming in, and those are replacing steamboats. 3 States was a big one. Just ran for about 6 months on the Suwannee River. Pretty good size, 140 feet long. And it's hard to imagine a 140-foot long steamboat on the Suwannee River today, but we had them. So she went over to Apalachicola and Chattahoochee. The last steamboat we had on the Suwannee River was the city of Hawkinsville. It was also our largest one. She was 319 tons, 141 feet long, 31 feet wide. She went between Hawkinsville, Georgia, and Altamaha River, but then by 1900 she moves to the Suwannee River and operates the rest of her life. She's very active from, say, Branford down to Cedar Key, usually towing cedar for the pencil factories at Cedar Key. And eventually she is no longer profitable by about 1914 or so, and so she is placed at her berth and allowed eventually to sink. And so she sinks, and she is still there as of today. She is one of the state underwater archaeological preserves that we have in Florida. And you can go see her now around Old Town even today. So railroads and cars kind of spell the doom for steamboats. Moving on, next few slides, and then I will be done. Aircraft. First known records I have are from about 15 years after aircraft were built. The Wright brothers built in 1903. I don't know, because our newspapers were burned up, whether there was another earlier entrance of aircraft in Suwannee County. But in 1918, November, I believe, we've got, in a newspaper article, there's a reference to an airplane flying over. And this is what it says. It says, quote, "Live Oak citizens were all out in the streets Tuesday afternoon, gazing at the skies, watching the maneuvers of an air bird circling over town, looking for a convenient place to land. When it was known that the plane would land on the Charles Baisden place near town, scores of autos filled with citizens went out to get a view of the air bird, and so great and eager were the spectators to investigate that a rope had to be thrown around the plane to keep them away. On investigation, it was learned that the occupants had come to Live Oak to attend the wedding of Mr. Cobb and Ms. Lula Hardy, who was the sister of Mrs. F.S. Paramore and Colonel Carey A. Hardy, which occurred yesterday morning. Carey Hardy at this point was in the legislature. 2 years later, he would be governor of Florida, and he lived here in Suwannee County. Quote, "Wednesday afternoon, the plane rose and circled over the town and distributed war literature, landing in a field southeast of the city." The First World War was still going on for another week or two. So they were distributing pamphlets for that. Quote, "It is stated the men were partially investigating suitable places as a landing station between Americus, Georgia, and Arcadia, Florida, and were favorably impressed with Live Oak as one of the stations, provided the city will take necessary steps for accommodations. The flight from Americus was made without a stop, 2 hours and 20 minutes, nearly a mile and a half a minute. So about, not that far for us today. Probably drive just as fast. Over the next couple months, there were a couple more landings. So that's the first known one that I know of landings in Suwannee County. So we move on to the post-war, post-World War II. You've got the Civil Air Patrol that is established by the American government right before World War II. They served in World War II, but they're a civic organization that still exists in the United States today. They're kind of auxiliary of the Air Force today. But this field was called Workman Field, and it was built on the White Springs Road, what we know of today as County Road 136 towards White Springs. Dr. Workman is here on the right. He owned the property. Randy Mai was in charge of the local Civil Air Patrol. And this airport, or this air spot, when it was completed in, let me double check the date, 1951, it was the only airfield in the entire United States that was owned and operated by the Civil Air Patrol. So it was a big shindig. Thousands of people came. You had people from all over the country wanting to know about it and wanting to get stamps and stuff from it. Unfortunately, it only lasted a few years, and then times changed. Randy By moved on, Dr. Workman sold and moved on, and it's now part of the subdivision. Let's see. Suwannee County Airport was established in 1965. Going through my papers. It began in 1964, was finished in 1965. It cost $78,000 back then, which is about $750,000 today. Dedicated in 1965 and continues to operate. That's a picture of it in more recent times. But not only are there the Suwannee County Airport, there are also a lot of privately owned air parks, airfields, whatever you want to call them. And I've got a list of 18 plus, or 18 including the Suwannee County Airport. So we've got at least 18 that I know of in Suwannee County that are either privately owned or part of an air park subdivisions. This one, for instance, is Flying Little River Air Park. It's 3 miles southeast of McAlpin. It opened in 1977. So it's got, basically it's a subdivision with an airfield in it. And so people will land, they'll bring their planes, they'll fly in and out, they'll have get-togethers like this. They fly in, they call it, and people enjoy using them. So I am out of time. That was the end.